Dad and daughter go missing on a small boat. In the middle of the sea, 12 years later, wife discover. On a quiet summer morning in Charleston, South Carolina, the sun rose over the harbor, as it had every day for centuries. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional clink of coffee mugs at the corner diner and the soft hum of morning traffic. But for Charlene Carter, that morning felt different. Something was wrong. It had been 12 years, but she still felt the weight of an absence that no one could explain, an absence that had never truly made sense. Charlene stared out at the harbor from her front porch, the same spot where she had stood countless times over the years, watching the waves ripple and crash as if the sea itself might provide an answer. But all it had ever given her was silence. On August 5th, 2010, Charlene's life had been irrevocably altered. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend, a sailing trip with her husband Malcolm and their 13-year-old daughter Ayanna. But that night they never came home. Charlene had kissed them goodbye early that morning, watching from the porch as they boarded the boat, heading out for another one of their weekend sailing trips. It was something they'd done before. There was nothing unusual about it. Malcolm, a seasoned sailor with a calm demeanor, had promised her they'd be back by Sunday evening, just in time for dinner. Ayanna had waved her face, hidden behind her brown locks, a look of quiet contentment on her face. A simple promise. But as the day stretched on, and the sun sank beneath the horizon, that promise slipped further and further from reach. By Sunday night, Charlene had already begun to worry. She tried calling both of their phones, but the calls went straight to voicemail. No word, no sign. The house felt emptier with each passing minute. She waited, though, refusing to believe something had gone terribly wrong. She heated dinner, checked the clock repeatedly, and reassured herself that perhaps they were just late. Malcolm had always been one to take his time when out at sea. But when Monday morning arrived, Charlene knew something had gone wrong. The Coast Guard was contacted. Hours passed with no word. By noon they found the boat adrift empty, but with no signs of a struggle, no wreckage, no bodies, just a drifting boat and an unsettling quiet. Charlene clung to the hope that they'd come back, that they had gotten lost or were simply delayed. The search efforts stretched into days. Helicopters combed the skies, divers scoured the waters, but nothing was ever found. No bodies, no debris, just an eerie stillness. Eventually, the case was closed. Presumed lost at sea, the official report read. They were gone, and nothing could explain how or why. Charlene, however, refused to accept it. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, she lit a candle in the window for them. It wasn't just for their memory. It was for the hope that they were still out there somewhere, that one day someone would find them. But that day never came. She couldn't let it go. Every day for 12 years she kept searching in her heart, in her mind, in the depths of her soul. Something was wrong, something didn't sit right. The absence was not just a loss, it was a betrayal, something she couldn't explain to anyone, not even herself. The pain never truly faded. It just morphed, taking different shapes over time. But that morning when the phone rang, something in her gut told her this time would be different. A friend sent her a video one that would unravel everything she thought she knew about the disappearance. And with it, a truth so stark, it felt like a punch to the chest. Her husband and daughter weren't lost at sea. They had chosen to leave her behind. Charlene's life in Charleston before the disappearance was that of a quiet, unassuming family woman. She had married Malcolm Bennett in 2004 after meeting him at New River Baptist Church. He was reserved, dependable, and solid, everything Charlene had ever wanted after the heartbreak of losing her first husband to illness. Ayanna, her daughter, had been 8 years old at the time, and Malcolm had treated her with quiet respect, never pushing for affection, but offering it patiently. For years, the family was picture perfect. Malcolm and Ayanna developed a special bond. He began taking her out, sailing, a shared hobby between father and daughter, one that Charlene thought was healthy. After all, he was patient, respectful, and most importantly, reliable. But after their marriage, something started to shift. Malcolm began taking Ayanna out to sea more often, sometimes without warning. What began as a once-a-week event turned into an obsession. Charlene noticed the changes in her daughter. Ayanna grew quieter, more withdrawn. She locked herself away in her room, taking longer showers, hiding a journal where she wrote, "The sea feels safer than land." At first, Charlene chalked it up to adolescence, but the changes became more unsettling. Ayanna started preferring to stay home, rather than going to social gatherings. She stopped going to church, an activity that had always been important to the family. Charlene noticed how her daughter became more distant, more reserved, but she couldn't put her finger on it, not until it was too late. Charlene also noticed other things that didn't add up. Ayanna's new backpack, one that wasn't hers. The way Malcolm seemed so guarded when she asked about the trips. When she found Ayanna's journal with that strange entry, her unease grew. But still, Charlene ignored it. She wanted to believe it was just growing pains. Then came the fateful day in 2010 when they went sailing and never came back. As the Coast Guard pulled up the unmanned boat from the water, Charlene's stomach turned. Her mind raced. Where were they? Why wasn't there a single clue? Why didn't anyone see anything? The hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks. And then the final blow, the declaration that they were gone, lost at sea. Charlene was forced to let go, or so it seemed. The case was officially closed, and for the world, their story ended there. But not for Charlene. She kept looking, she kept asking, she kept hoping. Even when the world told her to move on, she couldn't. And now, 12 years later, the truth was about to emerge from the very depths of the sea. The video was blurry, sent by her old friend Sandra Logan. At first it seemed like just another vacation video, but then Charlene saw it. In the background, blurry at first, was a couple dancing, two people, who despite the years that had passed were unmistakable. It was Malcolm, and beside him, Ayanna. What would you do if you found out that the people you had spent years grieving weren't lost, they left you behind? That's the question that would haunt Charlene Carter for the rest of her life. And now, the hunt for the truth was no longer just a matter of looking for the dead. It was about confronting the people who had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. Charlene sat still, her hand trembling as it hovered over the screen of her phone. The video from Sandra was only 26 seconds long, but to Charlene it felt like an eternity. It was hard to explain how the simple motion of a couple dancing in a crowded festival could rip her world apart. The camera was shaky, the scene filled with vibrant colors, loud music and laughter. People spun in the sunlight, enjoying the festival atmosphere. It seemed like a moment of carefree joy, but Charlene's heart was already sinking. Then there they were, in the background, just slightly out of focus, but unmistakable to Charlene's trained eyes. There was Malcolm, older now, with graying hair and a thick beard, but still unmistakable in his stance, in the way he moved. And beside him, Ayanna. Not the little girl she had kissed goodbye 12 years ago, but the young woman she had raised. A woman who looked entirely different, but still there was no mistaking her. The same familiar features, the same tilt of her head when she laughed. That laugh. Charlene's blood ran cold as she watched it again and again. She could see the way they moved together, close, comfortable, like they belonged in each other's arms. The way Malcolm held Ayanna around her waist, his arm firm and possessive. The way Ayanna leaned in, pressing her cheek to his, a soft laugh escaping her lips. In that instant the world tilted. For 12 years, Charlene had been living with a story she had convinced herself was true, that her family had been lost to the unforgiving sea. She had mourned them both. She had lived through the agony of never knowing what happened to them. But now, as she watched the screen, the truth broke through. They hadn't been lost. They had made a choice. They had chosen to disappear, to leave her behind without so much as a trace. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. She watched the video again, her finger frozen over the play button, unable to look away, unable to stop the flood of emotions crashing through her. She felt betrayed, abandoned, deceived. Every thought she'd had for the last 12 years, the hope that maybe they were out there somewhere waiting to be found, crumbled before her eyes. They had been alive all along. They had found each other, built a new life, and never once thought to look back. And she had been left to bury them both, to light candles for ghosts who weren't dead, but had simply turned their backs on her, left her in the silence of their absence. The grief she had carried for all those years, the pain that had hollowed her out, now seemed even worse. They hadn't been taken from her. They had left her willingly. She stared at the phone, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill her throat, tightening with the sharp sting of realization. For so long she had wondered what had really happened. Now the answer was clear, but it was far worse than anything she could have imagined. As the video played on, Charlene's mind raced. She thought about the years she had spent keeping up appearances, going through the motions, hiding behind a wall of silence. The community had never asked too many questions, never pushed her to move on. Everyone believed the official story. Everyone believed they were lost at sea, victims of a freak accident. But Charlene had always known deep down that it wasn't that simple. Something had felt off from the moment the boat had been found adrift, with no sign of struggle, no distress call, no explanation. There had to have been more to it, but she couldn't put the pieces together until now. The person she thought she knew, Malcolm, the man who had been her husband for 6 years, wasn't the same man she had married. The man who had patiently stepped into her life and her daughters, who had seemed so stable and dependable, had turned into someone else entirely. She had trusted him, but now that trust was a lie. And Ayanna, her daughter, who had been everything to her, had become something entirely different too. Ayanna's innocence had been stolen, replaced with a carefully cultivated facade. No longer the little girl who called her mommy at night, Ayanna had stepped into a different world, a world where her bond with Malcolm was something far more sinister than Charlene could have imagined. The relationship between father and daughter had been warped, twisted into something that should never have been. Charlene didn't know what to do with this newfound truth. It felt like her entire life had been built on a false narrative, and now that narrative was collapsing under the weight of her own discoveries. How could she confront them? How could she even begin to process the years of lies, the years of betrayal? And more than that, what did she do now? The video had given her no answers, only more questions. The man in the video, Malcolm, and the woman beside him, Ayanna, were still alive. But how long had they been together? How long had they been living this new life, hiding in plain sight? And why hadn't they ever reached out to her? Why hadn't they come back? Charlene sat still, her phone resting in her lap, as the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. She felt like she was drowning again, but this time it wasn't the sea, it was the truth. The truth she hadn't wanted to face, the truth she hadn't been ready for. But now there was no turning back. She couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, about what she was going to do with the knowledge she had. The knowledge that her family had vanished into the world, leaving her behind, living a life without her. Charlene wasn't sure what drove her to act next. Maybe it was the fury, the betrayal, or maybe it was the need to finally make sense of all the years of uncertainty. Whatever it was, she knew she couldn't let it go. She couldn't just sit by anymore pretending that they had drowned. She needed answers. She needed to face them. And so she made a decision. Charlene's decision came swiftly, but the weight of it hung over her like a shadow. She couldn't sit idly by, hoping that time would somehow erase the sting of betrayal. No, this was something she had to confront head-on, even if it meant shattering everything she had spent 12 years trying to rebuild. The next morning, as the sun rose over Charleston's waterfront, Charlene packed a small suitcase with a handful of clothes and essentials. She didn't make a list, didn't plan her journey in any way that might have allowed her to reconsider. She just moved, packing quickly and efficiently like she had done 100 times before. But this time, there was no careful thought, no hesitation. This time she was moving to uncover the truth, to find answers she had been denied for more than a decade. She withdrew cash from her bank account, enough to cover a flight and some expenses for the trip ahead. There was a finality in her movements, a quiet resolve. As she closed the door behind her and walked down the steps of her home, she left behind the life that had defined her for so long. The house, still haunted by the ghostly memories of Malcolm and Ayanna, would remain untouched, waiting for her return. But Charlene knew that she wouldn't be returning as the same woman who had left just hours before. She was no longer the grieving widow or the broken mother. She was a woman on a mission. Charlene's flight to Ecuador wasn't direct. She first flew to Miami, then boarded a second plane to Quito, Ecuador, where Sandra's video had been filmed. The flight felt like an eternity. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't engage with the other passengers. Her mind was focused only on the journey ahead. Every bump of the plane, every hum of the engine seemed to pull her deeper into the storm of emotions churning inside her. She thought about the years spent waiting. 12 years of unanswered questions, of grieving for people she thought were gone forever. 12 years of lighting candles and offering prayers for their souls. She had been a widow and a mother without a daughter, and now all that grief seemed so empty. The people she had mourned hadn't been lost. They had chosen to disappear, and she had been left in the dark. Charlene knew the truth now, but she didn't know what to do with it. She had seen them in the video, Malcolm and Ayanna alive together, and far from the people she once knew. How long had they been living this lie? Had they really thought she would just move on? What kind of people left their loved ones behind, without a word, without a single trace? When Charlene finally landed in Quito, she didn't waste time. She took a bus to the coastal town Sandra had described, following the route from the video with nothing but the blurred image of Malcolm and Ayanna in her mind. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't ask for directions, even though the language barrier was difficult. She simply kept her eyes trained on the road, on the towns she passed, on the faces of the locals. She arrived in the small coastal town a day and a half later. It wasn't a tourist spot. It was quiet, serene, almost too perfect. The smell of salt water mixed with the scent of grilled food from the roadside stands. Children played soccer in the streets, and the locals walked leisurely, their footsteps slow and steady in the warm tropical air. It was a world far removed from the one Charlene had left behind, but it was the world where Malcolm and Ayanna had chosen to start over. She found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the town, a place with peeling paint and rusted hinges. The air conditioning didn't work, and the bed creaked under her weight, but it was enough. She handed the clerk cash for 2 nights and didn't offer her real name. She was no longer Charlene Carter, the grieving widow. She was someone else now, someone who needed answers. Charlene spent the next 2 days watching. She had nothing but her notebook and the still image from the video to guide her. She tracked their movements, the times they left their house, the streets they walked, the places they went. She watched as they passed by the small bakery with blue shutters, the cafe, where Ayanna taught English to local children. She watched them hold hands in the market, exchange small pleasantries with the townspeople, and walk together along the beach. She followed them, kept her distance, never too close, but always there. The changes in them were subtle. Malcolm Miguel now still had the same confident walk, the same casual ease that came from years of being in control. He wasn't the man she had married. He had become something else. And Ayanna, her daughter, had transformed into someone entirely different. She wasn't the little girl who used to cling to her mother for comfort. No, Ayanna had grown into a woman who no longer looked back at the life she had left behind. As Charlene stood on the edge of the beach, watching them walk hand in hand, something inside her broke. She realized with painful clarity that the people she had once known were no longer part of her world. They had created a new one, and in doing so, they had erased her from it. The grief she had carried for 12 years suddenly took on a different shape. It wasn't just the pain of losing them. It was the pain of knowing that they had chosen to leave her behind. She was no longer just a mother who had lost her child. She was a woman who had been abandoned. And no matter how much she had prayed, how much she had waited, there was no going back. There was only forward, only the road ahead, and only the people who had stolen her life from her. The final day of her watch, Charlene saw something that stopped her cold. Ayanna, wearing a simple cotton dress, walked to the edge of the surf. She stood there for a moment, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand as she stared out at the horizon. Charlene could see it in the way Ayanna held herself, the way her eyes flicked toward Malcolm Miguel, before she stepped back toward him. She was still looking to him for approval, for validation. Charlene didn't know whether it was relief or fury that she felt. All she knew was that she had seen enough. She couldn't just watch anymore. It was time to act. Charlene's steps grew heavier as she approached the yellow house at the corner of the street. She stood across from it, watching the front door, waiting for the right moment. The sight of the home brought back memories she had fought to bury. The house didn't look much different from the one she had left behind in Charleston. The same warmth, the same sun-drenched exterior, the same sense of quiet security. It was a place that had been built for two people just like hers had been. But unlike hers, this house had never been meant for her. She couldn't ignore the weight of her past. It clung to her like the shadows that stretched across the street, waiting to swallow everything whole. But the reality was different now. This wasn't her life anymore. It hadn't been for years. For 12 years, Charlene had believed they were dead. She had lit candles for them, prayed for their souls, tried to believe in the story of a tragic disappearance, the ocean swallowing them whole. But now the truth had shattered that illusion. They hadn't drowned. They had vanished by choice. And the man she had loved, the man who had once promised to care for her and her daughter, had made a choice that tore everything apart. That afternoon, Charlene watched them leave the house again. This time they were holding hands, walking slowly down the street toward the market. She had waited long enough. It was time to make them face what they had done to her. Charlene crossed the street, her feet moving with purpose, her heart thumping in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, or even how she was going to say it. The rage, the hurt, the disbelief had all been building inside her for days. It was all coming to a head now. When Ayanna saw her, her eyes widened in recognition. She stopped mid-step, a look of confusion spreading across her face. Malcolm Miguel turned his head, following Ayanna's gaze. For a moment, none of them moved. The street felt frozen in time, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Charlene stood still, her eyes fixed on them. She couldn't find her voice at first. The words she had rehearsed in her mind were tangled in the mess of emotions swirling inside her. But finally she found them. "So it's true," Charlene said, her voice low but steady. "You didn't drown, you didn't die, you just left." Malcolm's face dropped, but not in shock, in disbelief. He blinked a few times, as though he were trying to convince himself that what he was seeing wasn't real. He stepped forward, but Charlene held up her hand. "No," she said, cutting him off. "Don't try to explain it to me." Ayanna took a step forward, her voice shaking. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. We didn't." "Don't," Charlene snapped, her voice sharp now, breaking through the calm. "Don't you dare protect him. You don't owe him anything." Malcolm raised his hand like he was about to speak, but Charlene wasn't having it. The floodgates of her emotions were open now, and she wasn't going to let them shut. "You were supposed to protect her," Charlene said, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to protect me. And you turned her into your partner." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Ayanna's eyes filled with tears, but Charlene couldn't look away from her. She didn't care about the tears. She cared about the truth. "You let me grieve you," Charlene continued. "You let me bury two people who were alive. You let me live like a widow, like a mother without a child. And now you're standing here like nothing happened, like I wasn't left behind." There was silence. The world around them seemed to fall away. Charlene stood there, the gun tucked into her waistband, still and steady. The moment stretched on until Ayanna opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. She stepped forward, reaching for Charlene, her face full of desperation. But Charlene couldn't look at her. All she saw now was the daughter she had raised gone. Gone without a trace. Gone without a single word. The past 12 years of pain, confusion, and unanswered questions came crashing down on her all at once. Every moment she had spent waiting, every sleepless night, every prayer, all of it for nothing. They had chosen to leave, and now they were back asking for forgiveness. But Charlene knew there was no way to undo the damage. "I gave you everything," Charlene whispered. "You were my whole world, and you chose him." Malcolm took another step forward, his face twisted with a mix of guilt and frustration. "Please, Charlene, just listen to me." But Charlene didn't want to listen anymore. She didn't want to hear their excuses or their justifications. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew the truth. With a calm, steady movement, Charlene pulled the gun from her waistband and held it at her side. The sound of it seemed to echo in the empty street, as if the world had stopped waiting for what would happen next. The gasps from the bystanders around them filled the silence. The children playing soccer nearby froze in place. A woman standing on a porch dropped her glass. It was the stillness before the storm. Malcolm took one more step toward her, his hand raised in a desperate attempt to calm her. But it was too late. The gunshot rang out loud and final, cutting through the silence. Malcolm's body dropped to the ground with a sickening thud, the sound of his fall reverberating through the street. Ayanna screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she reached for him. But it was too late. Charlene stood over them, the gun still warm in her hand, her chest rising and falling with every breath. Her face was expressionless, her eyes focused on the scene before her. The reality of it all had already set in. A second shot rang out, and Ayanna collapsed beside her father, her body crumpling to the ground in a heap. The street exploded into chaos. People screamed, doors slammed shut. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, but Charlene didn't move. She stood still watching them. She had finally stopped drowning. Charlene stood motionless as the street around her erupted into chaos. The gunshots had done their job, shattered the silence that had weighed on her for 12 long years. Malcolm or Miguel and Ayanna were no longer standing, no longer part of her world. But the world around her was still very much alive, and it was closing in fast. People rushed to their doors and windows unsure of what had just happened, some whispering in hushed tones, others staring with wide, frightened eyes. The once quiet, peaceful street where neighbors had smiled and waved was now a scene of confusion and disbelief. It wasn't supposed to end this way. She hadn't planned for this moment. But in her heart she knew it was the only way it could have ended. As the sirens grew louder, Charlene's thoughts drifted back to those long years of waiting. The endless nights she had spent staring at the empty boat slip, praying for something, anything to bring her family back. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. All the while she had been left with nothing but the echo of a memory, an empty space where once love and hope had lived. Now, standing in the fading light of the evening, with the sound of sirens growing louder by the second, Charlene felt no fear, only exhaustion. The weight of everything she had carried, her grief, her doubt, her frustration, had finally been put down. The truth had come in its own time, but it had come too late, and in that truth, Charlene had lost everything. But for the first time, she also felt a strange sense of peace. When the police arrived, it was a quiet procession. No chase, no sirens blaring in the distance. They had seen it all before, or so they thought. A woman in the street, a gun in her hand, the bodies of 2 loved ones lying in front of her. The scene unfolded exactly as they had anticipated. It was over. Charlene didn't resist as they approached her. There was no fight left in her. The emotions she had buried for so long, the anger, the grief, the sense of betrayal, were all out in the open now. She had let them go. She had faced them, had spoken the words that needed to be said, and now there was nothing left to do but allow the consequences to come. She placed the gun gently on the ground. The metal still felt warm, like it was holding onto the last vestiges of the violence that had transpired. She didn't look at it again. She didn't need to. Her hands were still steady. Her mind was clear. As they led her to the patrol car, Charlene didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her life had already been left behind in this place, with the people who had once meant everything to her. Now she was a stranger in her own skin. She had buried them. Now they had come back to bury her. The drive to the police station was a slow crawl, the sirens still echoing faintly in the background. Charlene stared out of the window, her face expressionless, but her thoughts were not still. They raced through her mind, tumbling over each other in a whirlwind of disbelief and acceptance. She had known the truth for only a few days, but it had already settled deep into her bones. She wasn't sure if it was anger or sorrow that would come next, but it didn't matter. The truth had come, and with it, the weight of all the years she had spent looking for something that didn't exist. They had left her. They had left her behind, and now she was left with nothing. At the police station, Charlene was booked quietly. No resistance, no argument. Just the inevitable march of a woman who had already fought her battles. The officers took down her details, bagged her belongings, $27 in cash, a motel key, a faded photograph of Ayanna from her middle school days. Charlene didn't need the photo anymore. She didn't need any of it. The weight of her life was now behind bars. For the first time, she felt like she could finally exhale. That night, Charlene sat in a small holding cell. The walls were cold and gray, the cot uncomfortable, but it didn't matter. There was no room left in her for discomfort. The silence felt like a balm after the storm. She had been loud for so long, screaming for answers, for closure, but now it was done. She was no longer the grieving widow, the anguished mother. She was just a woman who had been left behind, and now she had made her peace. When an officer brought her water, she accepted it without a word. She didn't need to say anything. The questions had been asked, and the answers were known. For the first time in years, she didn't have to chase the truth anymore. The next morning, Charlene asked to speak with an officer in charge. No lawyer, no public defender, no defense. She simply needed to speak. They led her into a small room, and she sat down at the table. The walls were peeling, the ceiling fan creaked, and the room smelled of stale air and metal, but none of that mattered. She was finally ready to speak her truth. "My name is Charlene Marie Carter," she began, her voice calm, collected, and steady. "I was born on April 2nd, 1975 in Charleston, South Carolina. I was a school counselor for 17 years. I had one child. Her name was Ayanna." She paused, then continued. "I met Malcolm Bennett at church. He was quiet, gentle, good with my daughter, or so I thought. We married when Ayanna was 8. At first, everything was fine. Then she changed. Slowly, it wasn't obvious at first. Just little things, less eye contact, more time alone with him. Then she stopped going to church, started locking her door. I chalked it up to adolescence." She folded her hands on the table. "In 2010, they went sailing just like they always did. He said they'd be back Sunday night. They never returned. The Coast Guard found the boat drifting, life jackets gone. No storm, no bodies, no answers. I lit a candle every August 5th for 12 years. I kept their room the same. I never dated again. I buried them without coffins." She took a deep breath and looked up at the officer. But something inside me always said they weren't dead, not both. The officer didn't interrupt, just listened. Then my friend Sandra went to Ecuador last month. She sent me a clip from a street celebration. I watched it once, then again. Then frame by frame I knew. That laugh, that hand, that man, that girl. It was them. Older, different, but them. I froze the video. It was them. Charlene paused again, steady, unblinking. I booked a flight. I flew there myself. I spent 10 days watching them, listening, asking around. The locals called them Miguel and Rosa. They taught. They smiled. They danced. They kissed. And no one knew who they really were. Not anymore. She leaned forward, her voice unwavering. They didn't drown that day. I did. I drowned when I realized they chose each other. I drowned when I realized they didn't need me to disappear. They just did it on their own. Charlene's hands flattened on the table. I bought the gun for $180. I don't know the man's name. I wrote a letter. I left it on the motel table. It said, "There's no fixing what's already dead." She glanced at the officer. I confronted them outside their home. I gave them a chance to speak, but there was nothing they could say that would unerase the last 12 years of my life. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She looked down and whispered, "I didn't kill strangers. I killed the ghosts who haunted me every day since 2010.